Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abby, and today we are doing something a little different. The recording you are about to hear is a panel that I was able to participate in at the recent Co-Creating Social World Symposium, co-hosted by Mercy University and the Taos Institute. On this panel, you will hear myself, Chris Hoff, and Mario Ismael Espinoza. The panel was facilitated by Somer Saleh, so you will hear her voice in here as well, along with a couple voices of participants of this symposium, people who were in the audience of this panel and contributing ideas or asking questions. I'm so excited to be sharing this with you because I have walked away from this symposium feeling incredibly energized and excited by the ideas that were shared in the conversations that I had. Not to mention the particular gift it is to get to be in person with the people in this community, many of whom I have only ever known online, but got to be with in person and have this gathering together. Another reason this is special to me is that this is the first opportunity I've had like this to do a panel and to get to be a part of a conversation as in part a representative of kind of the coming generations of what this work around communication, around social construction continues to look like. So as you will hear, the name of this panel was Hope, Agency, and Community Practices for Togetherness. I'm going to leave it there and let you join us in this conversation. You will hear many voices, you will hear many stories, and I hope that you can reflect on your own voice and story and how you might add to this ongoing conversation that we are all a part of. So with that, let's jump right into this panel.
Hi, everybody. We're going to do quick introductions. So I'll just reintroduce myself. My name is Somer Saleh. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have my own private practice. And I also do a lot of, as Dr. Bava said, I'm also a professor here. And then lastly, I do a lot of community organizing work with the Muslim community around kind of like bridging the gap between mental health and the Muslim community. So I guess that's the order that I got for that. Thank you. We're going to just do a quick round of introductions, and then Mario is going to ground us in a practice. Go for it, Chris.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Hoff. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm coming from Southern California. I'm the founder and director of California Family Institute, which is a community counseling practice that's mission is to make services available to all who can't access them. And so nobody's turned away, no matter what they can afford. And we're also a training site for student therapists and postgrads that are interested in narrative therapy, post-structural collaborative therapy, social constructionist ideas, those kinds of things. Or he, him pronouns.
My name is Abby Van Meter, and the pronouns I use are she, her. I'm the executive director of the CMM Institute. CMM is Coordinated Management of Meaning, which I think of this theory of communication as just a communication-centric lens on social construction. So looking at what's happening in our communication, looking at it instead of looking through it is the grounding for all my work. We make a lot of resources. I host a podcast called Stories Lived, Stories Told. So if you've talked to me this weekend, that's where you'll get to hear yourself once I put all of those stories together. We host webinars, we post resources online. We will be convening our own conference in 2027. So like this group, we're kind of a sister organization to the Taos Institute in many ways in terms of the kind of gathering that we want to bring in the world, the kind of invitation that we want to offer people in terms of real practical tools for co-creating better social worlds in our practices together.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mario Ismael Espinoza. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I am also a student of curanderismo. I'm a Mexican immigrant. And I'm going to be grounding us all. I'm going to offer a practice for grounding, both in our bodies and in community today. So I want to invite you all to just take a moment to connect with yourselves. I'm going to close my eyes for a second, but if you feel more comfortable just directing your gaze downward, you can do so. take a moment to connect with your breath, maybe connect with your heartbeat. Connect to your sense of hearing. Feel the temperature in the room. And just notice any information that your body is giving you. Now I'm going to invite you to open your eyes if your eyes are closed. And I'm going to invite you to look around the room and maybe pick somebody in the room that you haven't talked to already. If you feel more comfortable looking at somebody that you've already spoken with, you can do that. And as you look at somebody in the room, I'm going to invite you to just hold them in positive regard. It can be as simple as thinking in your mind, those frames look really good on you. It could be a wellness wish. I hope you feel rested. And then I'm going to invite you to do the same thing with somebody else. And again, just hold it in positive regard. You could think thoughts like, that's a great smile you're offering me. And then I'm going to invite you to focus inward again. Focus on your own body, focus on your own breath, focus on your heart for a second. And notice if anything changed. Maybe your breath changed, maybe it didn't, and it's okay. And then direct your attention back to the room and notice what it feels like to share a room with a lot of people offering positive regard to one another. And see if it feels different than when we first started. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mario. I know for me, I felt a bit awkward in my body, and now I kind of feel a little bit more positive and happy and settled a bit. So with that being said, today's conversation, as Dr. Bava said, is all about hope, agency, and community, practices for togetherness. What does that mean? What does that look like? And for those of you all here, we have a few questions that I'm hoping we can get through. Maybe it'll feel a bit structured. Maybe it might actually totally change as we go on, but I'm just letting you all know this is how we're starting right now. The first question that I have is for you, Abby. How does your approach to storytelling and your understanding of CMM help you create meaning and connections in the stories you tell and hear?
Thanks for that question. As I said, communication perspective is the language that I really hold on to, and I use that intentionally instead of communication skills. I think a lot of people out there that are talking about communication, you'll hear them talk about skills. Make eye contact. Look right here at someone instead of their eyes when you're public speaking if you're nervous, or nod when you're listening, or don't cross your arms. That's bad body language, and those are skills that can be really useful, but it's very much a surface level thing. What I'm interested in is a more embodied communication perspective. So if communication becomes your lens, and communication in the social constructionist sense of what are we making together in this moment? And not only that, but a more reflexive practice of what has been made, what are we making right now, and what can we do to make better social worlds together? And so I think with the communication perspective, then the lens becomes not just about content, but about process. So we make better social worlds when we talk about making better social worlds, but we're also making social worlds in everything that we talk about. And not just talk also, communication goes far beyond language. Everything we're doing communicates something. And so I think that there's an invitation here to complexity, to meet complexity, to navigate complexity, to lean in, because the reality is that our social worlds are incredibly complex. Stories, truths, little t truths for all of us coexist. And so the skill, the practice, the perspective for me then becomes about how do you sit with that reality? How do you act into that complexity? Because I think it's a understandable human tendency to want to simplify things, to put things into clean, easy boxes, some, simple meaning-making processes. But we do ourselves a disservice with that, I think. Thinking about my own experiences, it's only upon studying communication, learning about social construction, relational construction, that I was able to look back on my experiences of my family and realize, oh, okay, the hurt feelings, the miscommunication, the unwanted dynamics or harmful patterns that are at play, that's not an outcome of a lack of caring or loving or trying, but a lack of tools and language. And so for me, accessibility and, as Summer has said, practice is kind of the where you go from there, the so what, the what's next in that instance. And so I really see communicating as invitation, that, Saliha has already mentioned the self-organizing that we're engaging in. So we're paying close attention to what each other is doing. And every conversation, every comment, every action is an invitation in its way. Thinking about complexity, there's one story I want to share too, that I was part of a team that was facilitating a World Cafe, if any of you are familiar with that format, at a conference that was taking place in Norway in 2024. And the people that I was working with were very, very committed to emergence and the spontaneity. And I thought, okay, that's great, but what are we asking people? What's actually the question? I'm trying to put together a PowerPoint that is helpful for people, and emergence is not helping me here. Okay, you guys are so committed to emergence. I'll be the voice of plan and reason here. And so I think we struck a good balance of, as Saliha said earlier, minimal structure within which to improvise. But the experience that I've continued to reflect on is that I was introduced as a facilitator of this World Cafe, but also was a participant in it. And so one of the, again, more emergent, committed people in the group was the facilitator. And so I could feel in the room that there were some questions remaining even when we turned to the activity. And so the people at my immediate table looked to me as someone who'd been introduced as a facilitator at this. What's going on? What you tell us the inside scoop. We didn't really, understand what was just said. And I realized the power I had in that moment and the responsibility for how the rest of the conversation was going to go. If I leaned in and said, oh my gosh, yeah, I know that was so confusing, right? Here's what he really means. I'll tell you, I'll clarify things for you. But I felt my choice in that moment, and I kind of sat back and I went, yeah, it was really confusing. And I just let the discomfort of the not knowing, of the lack of clarity in that moment, be a part of the space and be intentional. And I gave a voice to, yeah, that is happening, and let's think of that as a neutral thing rather than a bad thing or a sign that there's been a failure. And so I think that going back to the idea of these tools, these resources, these perspectives that I hope people can, develop to better their own communication in their social worlds, I think there's a lot of discomfort and stress, maybe anxiety, worry, and that can feel like a sign to, oh, I have to step back. I want to step back and remove myself from this situation. But I think social construction offers us a lot of very real, tangible practices about how to step into the complexity. So that's just a story that I'm coming into this space with. And I imagine maybe some of you, even this weekend or in other gatherings, have experienced, the discomfort of the uncertainty. And so I'm curious about how people, reflect on that, or how they met those moments together and what we can kind of learn from that.
Thank you for sharing. I just want to look at you guys and see if any of you want to respond to anything Abby said. I know for me, what came up for me was, yeah, it can be like connection to communicating with folks can be really messy. And oftentimes I think that's why we do try to look for structure or kind of like a set of rules to guide us with. And we do want to connect, right? But what does co-creating in community look like? How are we able to kind of like stay in dialogue amid tension and power differences? I know, Abby, you mentioned you recognized your power in that moment. How can we co-create amid all of that? And this is not a question for you. If anybody wants to respond, you can go for it. What does co-creating community look like, right? How can we stay in dialogue when there is tension and power differences?
Yeah, also that what comes up for me is the responsibility that comes with power, right? And how we are conscious of the power that we hold, and how do we show up with responsibility? And when there's, and when we're faced with others that have more power and that perhaps they're not aware of their power, what's our relationship to them? And for me, one of the things that I always go to is assessment. Like, how do I assess my ability to stay in dialogue with somebody that has more power than I do, or who's exercising their power, perhaps intentionally or unintentionally? And that's going to be different, right? Every day, it's going to be different hour to hour, depending on how much I slept, depending on how well I've eaten. All of those things are going to be, they're going to determine my ability to be in community, to stay in a space where I feel safe, or I don't feel safe, or perhaps where safety continues to shift because of, the way that we're using language, the way that we're using posture, the way that we're communicating verbally, non-verbally. The assessment part for me has always been really important, to continue to check in with my breath and with my body and with my sweat glands. They tell me so much.
Thank you for sharing. Did you want to go, Chris?
Yeah, I agree with everything. I think I was thinking about sometimes, and I'll probably talk about this a little more, I think sometimes we think of power as like bad, and I think power is just power. I think Foucault was pretty clear on that. It's just how we take up power. And, I think there is now, I think a lot of our movements get undone because of this kind of view on power. And I think sometimes for successful coalition building and stuff, sometimes we need to background our specific subjectivity in particular ways and maybe let somebody have power. But like Mario said, responsibility and relational in how that's being done for sure. But I think, there is movements where we need to background our own, like we need to center some power.
Mm. Can you actually speak a little bit about the idea of coalitional imagination?
Yeah.
The concept, what it means actually in practice?
Yeah. So I came here, I'll tell a story too, if that's okay. I came here by way of, I think this is how I came here, got invited here by way of something I wrote last year called Beyond Community. And in it, about 20 years ago, I read an essay by Critical Art Ensemble. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. Their founder just passed away. They're actually from New York, and their founder just passed away last year. But and they had an essay called "Coalitions, Not Communities," and I'm going to read a quote from it because it's kind of provocative. And I started my paper with this quote, and I'll tell you a story about that. But it was. The idea of community, this is the quote, the idea of community is without a doubt the liberal equivalent of the conservative notion of family values. Neither exists in contemporary culture, and both are grounded in political fantasy. And yes, I was being provocative. Don't get mad at me. And Thick Press, which is a artist book publication, which we did the Encyclopedia of Radical Helping in, Erin read it and she goes, I want to make a zine of that. So she made a zine of it. It sold out really quick, but she put it on Instagram and it went viral. And the reason it went viral is because I think there's a lot of people, well, first of all, people push back on that idea. Like, how can we critique community in this day and age when community is so important, right? And it is important. But also, like one person I remember, he said, this is someone that sounds like he needs a friend. But also a lot of people who had been in movements like really resonated with that idea that I think we put on community a lot of work that it can't do, right? And coalition is very different, I think. And I think of, instead of community, I think of the commons. How do we, and that's maybe the language I use more is like, how are we in the commons? How are we, I'm influenced by like Jean-Luc Nancy, who wrote Inoperative Community, that community really happens at the edge of where we are, right? And I know many of you already know this. And that there's just different skill sets for community as there is for the commons, right? And I think sometimes we mistake what we're talking about is about community, but what we're really talking about is how do we move through the commons? How do we be in the commons again? All our third spaces are going away. It was said earlier, Ken was talking about the individualization of the tech platforms that's happening, that we're forgetting how to be in the commons together, and those are different skill sets. And so I became very interested in the idea of coalition, not community, right? Because it makes less demand. How can we organize around shared precarity rather than like shared identity or shared values? But and I use Minnesota as an example of that, right? All of a sudden, this community was under attack in a particular way, and you had neighbors that probably would normally not mix coming together to protect neighbors against a particularly shared precarity, right? And I think that is, we still talking about hope, and I get a lot of pushback at my clinic because somebody bought me a coffee cup that said "Hope betrays," because I'm always cautious about hope. But I think there are moments of hope like that where you see people coming together in the commons around shared precarity, not like shared identity. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I guess what comes to mind for me is the both and, right? What if we keep communities and also we keep coalitions and not try to replace one with the other, right? I think that it's important for communities to remain together and to continue to find strength and share that wisdom, right? When we are in coalition, what kind of wisdom do we bring from a community to a coalition and vice versa?
I would love to add one thing to that too. There's this language coming to mind as you're speaking about hierarchies of context, that we're all, all of us walked into this room with so many different contexts and stories that we're bringing with us. And I think there's a way to talk about context that can be really active, really hopeful, really proactive in the way where, okay, this language we're choosing to use, are we calling ourselves a community? Are we calling ourselves a coalition? Speaks to the question of, well, what is our highest level of context right now? What do we want it to be? And how would we act if that were true? So if gathering and being together, hearing stories and letting the power be that is the highest level context of community, as you said, it's not bad. It's just a different purpose. It's just a different highest level that you're naming and choosing. Being in a coalition would be a different highest level. Organizing, making change, giving power to people, and both have their space. And so I think the language piece becomes important in, I'm a strong believer of if you don't have the language to talk about what you experience, then you don't talk about what you experience. That's why consciousness raising groups are so important and have been throughout history as a step one, because the naming and then the action is when you can get people on the same page about something like the highest level context that we're working out of or choose to be or want to be working out of.
Yeah. And as you were speaking, Chris, I was thinking about you, Mario, right? And how a lot of us grew up in communities that have rich practices that kind of keep us together, right? I know, Mario, for you, your work draws on ancestral wisdom like curanderismo and on anti-oppressive relational practices. If you want, you can talk a little bit more about how that shows up in your practice and how you kind of experience it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does it show up in my practice? It follows me everywhere, right? It enters every room that I enter into, and I think it also makes me curious about, well, if I'm bringing in all of these people that have taught me, if I'm bringing in all of my teachers, all of my grandparents and their grandparents and all their wisdom into every room, who are all these people bringing in with them, right? We're not individuals. We didn't materialize out of anything. It makes me, I go back to, one of the things that comes up is like the responsibility as a wisdom keeper, right? I think we all are wisdom keepers. We've all been taught by somebody that really impacted our lives, and we're bringing that wisdom into the room, into conversations. And so then that, it brings me back to this idea of power. What kind of power does that give me? And how do I move in the space? What kind of responsibilities come with that power? What kind of privileges come with that power? And so, that's how it shows up for me. I'm thinking about the breakout room that we were just in, and we were talking about death and dying and the kind of relationship that we have with people that are, aging like we all are, and older folks. And we were talking about different types of death and my mind, and there was this idea of curiosity, like, what kind of curiosity are we bringing in, and what kind of practices emerge from that curiosity? And just in a really practical way, I was like, I'm seeing my sister's children's relationship to our elders are really contingent on our relationship with our elders, right? And I was thinking about like, okay, what kind of conversations do I want these children to engage in with my father, with my mother? And how am I the catalyst for that? And how often am I inviting the kids to sit around grandpa and me asking them questions that I want them to know? And so that, again, that type of curiosity came from my relationship, or the relationship that I wish that I had with my grandparents, right? Like I don't have a lot of, I don't have a relationship with like our indigeneity because my parents never fostered that, and so that to me feels like a responsibility as a curious person, right? How do I make sure that these children know that they draw from that knowledge, that they draw from that wisdom? And I can credit that directly to the curanderismo practices, because these are not my teachers' practices. These are ancient practices. They've come down, from so many different generations. They've changed, they've evolved. And so that's what I wanted to offer. I wanted to offer that to the conversation, the curiosity, and also, the responsibility that we have as curious people, not only to our clients and the people that we're working with, but also with our families, with our communities, with our coalitions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this conversation is about practices for togetherness, right? How are we creating hope? How are we creating, agency and community? And you're essentially saying, I have to be a keeper of stories so that they don't fall to the wayside, right? They don't disappear. And oftentimes, stories do get lost, whether it's intentional or unintentional. How are we all kind of keeping these stories and practices alive? What does that look like?
I think also, as I'm thinking about the children, right? I'm thinking about, are we giving them an opportunity to be wisdom keepers? Because if we don't make them part of the conversation, then they don't get that opportunity. They don't get it modeled. And maybe I'm projecting onto the children, and that's okay, I think, because I think it's resulting in change and praxis. I think that children as wisdom keepers is really important too, because they're holding on to information, right? Perhaps even probably mostly unconsciously.
Being stored, definitely.
Yes.
Right?
I think that's a really interesting piece to come to, of like, whether we name it or not, we're all coming with stories, whether they're told or untold, they're still influencing us. And it brings me back to the language of, the subtitle, I guess, of this conference, the reimagining. And I love that so much, as specifically not just imagining, because it situates us in a larger context where everything we've inherited was once imagined. And so we're in a long line of imaginers. And we have the ability to do that. And it helps us to relate, I think, to the meaning that exists in our world currently with slightly more open hands. because it reminds us that none of this meaning is innate. It's all stories. Somebody just once said, this is the story, and that became the dominant discourse, and that's why we have it today. And so there's a curiosity and, again, an invitation to zoom out, I think, on yourself by using that language of reimagining and seeing everything we're doing as reimagining in part and co-imagining, collaborative reimagining maybe is the right word, that it's happening together. So that's like, to take it really literally, what's the practice of togetherness? I think the collaborative reimagination, whatever that looks like, is very central, I think, to everything we're talking about.
I'm also curious for you, Abby, or you, Chris. I know, Mario, you mentioned for you, what does the reimagining or staying in conversation look like? You said it changes hour by hour, right? Day by day with whatever's happening in my body, in my sweat glands, right? For you, Abby or Chris, what does it look like to kind of be able to stay in the reimagining, to stay in conversation when there is difficulty?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I was thinking about where in my life am I really confronted with that challenge. And for the sake of disclosure, I'm a person in recovery. I've been clean and sober for a while now, and I participate in 12-step, which we included in the Encyclopedia of Radical Helping. And it doesn't seem like radical helping, but I make the case for it in this way, that I sit regularly with people that are on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Politically, for example, than I am, right? And some of their ideas, they're very difficult and hard to swallow and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is that if I called one of those guys in the middle of the night and asked them for help, they would come help me. And I know that. And that's what keeps me in that conversation, right, in my own life. And it's about, again, and so what did I learn? What am I learning from this? It's about shared precarity, trumps like identity, values, all these kinds of things, right? And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now, from that personal example of staying in the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I would add to that keeping this kind of frame of hope, and I think what all of us would want, a very actionable hope, a looking to the future, a practice of naming what is that better of the better social worlds. I think there's value in naming that so you can work backwards from there. This dynamic I've already mentioned of if this, then that. If I really believe that this is the better, how would I act to make that true? And so that takes me back to the idea of these coexisting stories, the complexity of the reality, that all of our stories, sometimes contradictory, still coexist. And so if that is true, how does that mean we need to act into the world? And so I think we have to go back to language of responsibility. We have a responsibility not only as storytellers, but story hearers, as the listener to, I think it's really easy when you have one person or three people sitting in front of you in a room like this, that the positioning sets the context of this person has the story. Mm-hmm. You take your notes, you hear what they've said, and you walk out with that. But if you can hear the one story being told as one of many, then I think that enables you to relate to that one story differently. It's not saying that story's wrong. It's not a question of right or wrong, but it's a question of multiplicity. And do you have, again, the capacity in your communities, in your coalitions, in your relationships, in your systems? Have you gotten the opportunity to practice the capacity for holding space for that kind of complexity? And so I think that's the practice for me.
Have you already seen that happen in the communities that you're in?
I would say, and as I mentioned earlier, I host a podcast, and you can definitely see my own growth over the 5 seasons of the podcast, that when I went into those very early episodes, I was a very different conversation partner. And I would come to those with maybe 10 questions for a 60-minute conversation, because I thought, okay, I've got the plan, and oh my gosh, how am I going to fill 60 minutes? And I want this person to know that I am researched and I am on top of things. And so I found myself overly structured in terms of maybe this person has responded to one of my questions in this really beautiful way, but I can't follow where they're taking me because I've got question number 2 already lined up. So we are going back to that. And now I ask maybe 3 questions in advance of when people come on my podcast. And one of them is introduce yourself. So I've learned to keep my questions as a story hearer in that space really open-ended. And I've learned to trust myself and my conversation partner in the emergence of what the conversation's going to be. And again, to go back to the idea of discomfort, some people have found that really uncomfortable. At the end of recording, they kind of go, I hope that was what you wanted it to be. I don't know what that was. And I'm like, yep, that's the point. It was the meandering. It was the wandering together in conversation. It's, makes marketing the podcast a little more challenging that I can't say, you're going to take away these 3 great goals for how to whatever, there's a lot of podcasts that'll offer that, again, going back to kind of surface level skills. But I'm just offering the, as I said, communication as an invitation. What I'm talking about there, I guess, is modeling that in being the kind of storyteller and story hearer that I practice and, perform as on my podcast. I'm hoping that I am modeling an invitation for other people to do the same. So I share honestly and openly and vulnerably and curiously and uncertainly in the hopes that I am giving the other person permission to do the same.
I love it. And I think one thing that's coming up for me as I hear you speak and I hear all of you speak, it's just this idea of just being human in conversation, right? Like, how can we retain and hold on to our humanness? That can be a practice in and of itself, right?
I like that. I've been very captured by Edward Glissant's work around the archipelago. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's an archipelago is like a group of islands with sea between them, and he counters that to root thinking. I've been thinking about pluriversal thinking and then one world thinking, right? And oftentimes communities, not to be critical, but can often enforce what Glissant called root thinking or one world thinking. And his antidote to that was the archipelago, right? Like we're all kind of islands. And actually the relationship is the sea between us, and all the stuff is there. But we don't have to be subsumed in any particular way to be part of the thing. We're all kind of just our little island, but we're all connected through a sea of all this stuff, even traumas and all those kinds of things. So, yeah.
I like that analogy. Mario, I know you wanted to go as well. Did you want to share?
Yes, and I forgot what I was going to say because I was listening to what you were sharing. I love what you were sharing about, story listener and how we show up as listeners and how we model being good listeners. I don't think I just did that because then I totally forgot everything that I was going to say. I love this idea of being islands that are connected and are in the oceans connecting us. I think one world thinking and plural universe thinking, that also got my mind. I was redirected back to some of the one of the perspectives that curanderismo has shared with me. Well, it's something that came from Eduardo Duran and Luis Mel Madrona, and these are folks that are both indigenous and also clinical psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, psychiatrist, and they talk about two-eyed seeing, right? With one eye seeing the world, our clients, ourselves from like the Western paradigm, and with the other one with something other, right? Non-Western or whatever Western means, right? And so for me, the other one comes from how did my ancestors see this? How did traditional healers see the same thing that we're looking at it through this sort of Western psychology model, pathology-driven model, and what are the congruencies, and how can I understand the person? I don't know, from a wider lens, with a wider lens. That was coming up for me, and I was trying to think about what does that look like for me as a story listener, right? And in that. How depends on what lens I'm listening to you with. That's going to inform the world that I make up, right? And what I bring with me of your story as you share your story, depending what lens I'm looking at it through. that's how I'm going to make sense of it. And then when I retell your story, it's going to sound different because I listened with that lens. And so then that question becomes for me, am I being intentional with what lens I'm looking at this through, I'm listening with, right? Because that's going to inform what I take with me, what my notes are going to look like. And I'm not texting, I'm looking at my notes. So I want to just share that too.
It's reminding me again of what you said earlier, of like the responsibility of being like a conscious human being at the end of the day, right? How are we consciously engaging with one another, being conscious of whatever stories we potentially may have that we've either absorbed or taken in, and how am I kind of like using the double eyes or the two eye concept that you brought, right? Of just kind of like recognizing where it's either coming from, I want to kind of like push away or take in, right?
And it also, like, as you were saying this, I recognized that I have more than two eyes, right? Because I have my clinical eye, and then I also have this sort of like ancestral lens, but then I have all these other lived experiences, right? As a queer person, as a gender expansive person, am I listening? How am I listening? What eye am I using in this conversation? And what eye am I going to use when I'm retelling the conversation too? Because it's going to sound differently if I'm telling my parents about this conversation that we have had, or if I'm trying to share the wisdom that I'm gathering here with one of my clients. It's going to sound totally different too, and so the story is going to change.
I love that. I want to be mindful of time. We're going to turn it to Q&A, but before we turn it to Q&A, I just want to check in. Is there anything any of you want to share before we turn this way? Okay, thank you guys so much. Anybody have any questions?
Hi, my name's Kathy. Chris, I just was really interested in, first of all, I love the story about your relationships with the folks in AA. Like, I really loved it. And I just have found that at this point in my life, what you were saying about how you see sort of community versus a coalitional convergence or whatever the other word is. I got it wrong, sorry. But and I think I've always thought of community as being really other than geographic, really other than like-minded. And my own work through the Eastside Institute and other organizings, just really about creating community of difference, and that we are the other. We are all the others. So I just really would love to hear more about identity as more fluid. I'm sort of anti-identity, if that's allowed to be said. I don't know. But would just love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I would, because this question might come up a little bit, but so I'm very influenced by Judith Butler's work, and, she has written in a couple places about if marginalized folks of all, whatever, are going to coalesce in a particular way, you're going to have to background specific subjectivity, meaning identity. You're going to have to background and foreground something else. And she's very clear to say this isn't erasure, right? This is strategic. And I think we've lost this strategicness in some ways, right? And so, because I want to make sure I'm clear that it's not erasure of identity or anything like that. It's just backgrounding for a little bit, foregrounding something else. And my argument maybe, or what I'm experiencing, and I have nothing resolved on any of this, but my curiosity right now is around shared precarity and how that brings people together. Also, and Summer kind of referenced this, about the storytelling. We're in the battle for the narrative right now, right? I don't know, in this post-truth era, there's a battle for the narrative right now of like, what is shared precarity? And they're dividing us through that too. So it's challenging work, but I think we have to begin. I think a lot of our movements have fallen apart, quite honestly, because they weren't strategic in that way. Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions they want to ask?
Shared precarity, really interested in this. I looked up precarity while you were talking, and an interesting other way of relating to precarity is as uncertainty, the risk of uncertainty. And I was thinking about Ken and Amos's coming together as father and son, cross-generation. There was the closeness that allowed them to be uncertain and to, I think they talked about resourcing other ways of being together that didn't get them stuck. And I was wondering if, as a therapist and a clinician, you think about precariousness as that kind of uncertain dance.
Love this question. Thank you for setting me up.
Okay, great.
So I've been telling people I don't call myself a therapist anymore. I call myself a liminal space tour guide, and or a guide, or some version of that. Because I think the work ahead of us now, as we're co-creating social worlds, is going to require traversing very destabilizing liminal space, right? And we're doing. I know I'm plugging the Encyclopedia of Radical Helping here for some reason. I don't know, but Rachel was asking me last night about what I was contributing to it, and I'm contributing negative capability to it, which it was a term coined by John Keats, the poet, about the ability to tolerate uncertainty, right? And, that a lot of I think my work as therapists is walking with, of course, but how do we help people tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, and whatever, so they don't keep going back to the known and familiar where we get stuck over and over and over again. So we really have to, I think my work now is how do we imagine, how do we regain our imagination that is being defutured from us in various ways. And like you said, I think you said, these systems aren't natural, right? They're historic, they're contingent, and they're changeable, right? And so sometimes I think we forget that.
Lady on this end would like to. Oh, okay, I see Anne passing the mic. Thank you.
This is an ongoing conversation I'm having with some folks. But you brought up two-eyed seeing, which is a recent thing I'm learning about through some work with the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. And it's led to this conversation. I work a lot with neurodivergent folks and a lot with queer folks. And so we've been having sort of an ongoing conversation about what's the difference between unmasking and what's the difference between code switching. Because it seems obvious to all of us that there is a difference between those things, and we've really struggled to articulate what that difference is. And so even in talking about strategy and strategic approaches, it feels like there's some intentionality to that, but I think it also plays with some of the unspoken power structures that we deal with. So I don't have a great question here. I'm just curious if that brings up responses for y'all.
I would love for you to share a little bit more about what is the working definitions that you all have. I mean, if you feel comfortable sharing, because this is not something that I have really leaned into.
Sure. Well, we talk about with neurodivergence unmasking as not trying to follow those social norms that we've been taught or we've been indoctrinated into, or we've sort of soaked up in the environment, and just being our quirky, weird selves and meeting our resource needs in whatever way makes sense to us, whether that's a sensory thing or a resource management type thing. And then as a white person, code switching is a thing I know other people have used those words, but it's one that I'm less familiar with. But there's an overlap with unmasking there, but being able to play with dominant culture norms, and then also drawing on indigenous heritage or different cultural backgrounds. And again, one of my other specialties is religious trauma, and so my cultural norming isn't a thing. I don't have a cultural cachet to fall back on as a white guy who was raised Christian, who isn't Christian anymore. That's been an interesting thing for me. So I think, I'm not answering your question at all.
No, you did. I feel like you educated me, at least. I don't know how many folks here felt educated by those definitions. And when you were talking about code switching, to me, that is a form. I think that the two-eyed seeing is not unlike code switching, but it's grounded in power. It's grounded in the strength that it comes from being able to switch codes, from being able to be a person that speaks a certain way and then being able to speak a different way when I speak to my parents. That's a form of code switching. And I think being able to switch, being able to look at the world from one lens and then the other at will, that I think that we're speaking about congruent things, but I think when I think about two-eyed seeing, I think about the power inherent in that. Thank you for your education. I was thinking about a question because everybody here has so much wisdom, and I wonder if there's, when we're talking about practices of togetherness, what are y'all leaving with? What are you bringing in? Like, what are some practices that you're like, oh, these folks didn't talk about that, and I feel like they should know? Because there's so much wisdom in this room already. I believe that.
Well, linking this to what Sally has said earlier about U.S. centering things, I was thinking about my community in Mexico, and how we are used to having a really rich community there, and how it is easy. You leave your house and you know your neighbors, and that's something easy. There's a park right across outside my house, and they have yoga classes at 7 p.m. just self-organized, and you can jump in if you want. So that's the kind of community I live in. So when you make this difference between community and coalition, for me makes sense having a community and talking about situations and then organizing for doing. So I really like this idea that you shared about is this and this, not moving only to one. And what I'm learning today is that in other contexts, it is necessary to have coalition rather than community, or not rather, but to put the accent or the energy in some other, and that is not something that I would experience maybe in Guanajuato, in my small town. I cannot speak for all of Mexico.
Thank you for sharing.
I want to stay with your question, but I also want to respond with a question which could be considered a practice. What are the practices of power when you speak of power? And you just touched on it, Chris, a little bit like a Foucauldian reference and went off. But I hear 4 different voices here. So what are we speaking about when we're speaking about having power? Are we talking about positional power, situational power, social power? And I say this because Sheila and I were talking about it, and I didn't. As we were talking, there were so many places we could have gone, we didn't go. And I was reflecting on discursive power. And so I would like to hear a little bit upon what are the practices of power you're speaking about, and how do we be conscious of all these different forms and more that we haven't yet language, as you said. Yeah. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for giving us options and texture to what power can look like. I love this question. I have to think about it.
I think for me right now, it's about political power is what I'm thinking about. How as I'm watching, everything that I'm watching on, I'm thinking about political power all the time. Yeah, and how can we regain it?
A little bit more about political power is
political power in the way that I'm conceptualizing it is like, how can we coalesce together in particular ways to regain political power to stop the madness? That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Yeah.
I would love to add to that before we move on. The lens I have, because I can't not thinking about communication all the time, is interpersonal power. And I think that can feel like small potatoes in the face of such large issues in the world, such horrible things going on where individuals feel really powerless. It's not to say that feeling's not real or valid, but both and, to what you were saying, yes and, that improv practice of both can be true at the same time, that it's important for us to acknowledge the interpersonal power that we do have, that we're all creating patterns together. And so I think, Sheila kind of mentioned the seductive power of if you stop engaging in a pattern, then that pattern can't continue, and you might invite the other person to be curious or engage in a new pattern with you. And that's a power that we all have, because the reality is, Ken used the word coordinating earlier. We're all coordinating all the time. We might not be coordinating well. We might not be creating a lot of coherence, but we are coordinating with each other. We're co-creating, whether we're co-creating something, that we would name as good or productive or better is the question, the ongoing question. But I just really like this language to help us understand. I think because maybe the larger context feels choiceless, that choices are being made for us. Nobody's asking me who we should go to war with. So I feel very powerless in that regard. But where I do have power is in the conversations that I have in my individual social world about it. And I can model that kind of curiosity. I can model that kind of relationship to multiple stories coexisting in a way that invites other people to turn out or do it in their social worlds, And maybe that seems naive to talk about, but I think there's a real sense for people that the issues of our world are so big, and so we have to get small, and we have to get interpersonal, and we have to lean in to people and ask questions. I'm reminded of someone I knew when I was at an undergraduate. This person was a graduate that I looked up to, and they were very politically progressive, and they said, I just don't talk to anyone who I disagree with. And I thought, whoa, we're in the communication department. That's a crazy thing to say. And it just struck me as being so undialogic. And again, as a younger person who was looking up to this person, there's a moment where I tried to make that make sense to me. Why would someone choose that? What does that do? Where does that come from? So I can understand that temptation, and also being someone that is committed to dialogue, I see the lack of curiosity there. And because that is a really hard thing to do, to tread that line of, well, I can't be curious because then I'm endorsing that person's thoughts or saying it's okay. So I think there's a way to offer curiosity in a way that is still invitational, and we can hold firm in our own beliefs about what is right, what is good, how people should be treated, what is just, what is humane, and also have space to hearing someone else's story and understanding it for the context it emerges from. Yeah, I'll go ahead and pause there because I know other people are already raising their hands.
When I hear you talk about curiosity as an antidote to that, it makes me think about, I don't know where I learned this, and I should be better at cataloging like where this wisdom comes from, but I'm not really that good because there's always so much wisdom coming in, right? It's hard to keep track of it. But I learned that curiosity and fear is really hard for the brain to hold curiosity and fear at the same time. And when I hear you say that there was a person that was like, I refuse to listen to somebody that I don't agree with, I think about capacity. Oh, this person doesn't have the capacity to listen. And then curiosity. Why? I wonder what kind of fear there is in this person to have somebody challenge their beliefs, or have somebody, how afraid is this person to, I don't know, listen to somebody that is going to say something that is going to disturb their world. So again, I go back to capacity, and I would say, okay, when are the moments where this person is more open to hearing something that they don't agree with? And then when we were talking about power, my mind went to medicine, right? Because medicine can heal, and if you take it without being ill, it could cause some harm, right? And I think it's the same with power. Power is not good or it's not bad. Power is just power. It's what we do with it. It's how we interact with it. It's how we embody it, and how we respond when others are under the influence of power. So that's what was coming up for me, was the relationship and how it's in. We all have power, but we can also be influenced by power. So these are some of the thoughts that were coming up for me.
Well, I don't know if this is a question. It's a little bit of tying together our earlier session with what you all have said. Thank you. Very rich. I was taken by this notion of being a responsible storyteller. And you talked about storytelling and story hearing. And what I'd like to add is story seekers. I mean, that's where the curiosity comes in. And then the link, Ilana asked us in the last session, knowing that we're all going to age and be elders, what can we do now that will help us and our social worlds? And I think one of the answers is collect stories. Just collect stories. Tell me about a time. And hear them and put them in your pocket. And if you forgot who you heard them from, then make it up. One of my favorite professors, and it took us about a year to catch on, all his stories were about his grandmother. And she was remarkable and amazing, but we later on found out it wasn't all about her. She was a great person to tell the story about. And it sunk in. And so I think it's important for another kind of power, elder power, right? That you become the storyteller. I had a nephew who was so frightened to start his own business. And everybody in the family kept saying, you can do it, you can do it. And one day I just realized he didn't know his grandfather. And I said, your grandfather was an entrepreneur. He had a very successful business. And my nephew perked up. He wanted to hear about his grandfather. He wanted to hear about his grandfather's business. And it was like, if I hadn't thought about that story, I'd just be another person saying, you can do it, to a kid who didn't believe he could. But once he had the story of how somebody else did it, he could follow that story. So that's the other thing. Collect stories of the details of how life works. And then you can share those stories. Mm-hmm. So I just had to weave that in because it was such a great question. And thank you.
Thanks, Diana. I want to say, just to put a name kind of on what you're talking about, not to sterilize this like really beautiful human process, but I think a real function of stories is to expand our imagination. And so that's what, some people might be like, oh, I can't name it, but I love to hear about my grandparents, or I love to hear about my neighbors, or I love to meet new people. The stories expand our imagination of what is possible.
Abby, I want to jump in there with you. I don't have the microphone, but it's just not the imagination. It's the specifics.
Yeah.
Right? Your grandfather walked, my grandmother walked across Italy to get on a boat. Oh. We could walk to go to a protest. So it is, yes, the imagination, and it's the specifics. It's how we learn through stories.
Yeah, I don't even mean imagination as this big, abstract, playful, okay. I'm a kid, I'm bored, so I imagine I'm a pirate on a pirate ship. But just the small level imagining, I can imagine that for myself now, or I can imagine that for someone else, this different way of being. So that's where I want to
And may the conversation continue.
With that being said, I just want to thank you all so much, and thank you guys for listening.
Give it up to them. Yes.
Okay, that is all for today's episode, but remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. You can email questions, reflections, ideas, and stories to storieslived.storietold@gmail.com for a chance to be featured in an episode. You can comment on our Instagram at storieslived, Stories Told Pod, or the CMM Institute YouTube page to engage with other listeners. And you can subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to make sure you're getting every episode right in your inbox. Links to all these places can be found in the show notes for this episode. Other ways you can support this podcast are by following, rating, and reviewing the show wherever you listen. Plus, please share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, an organization dedicated to furthering the coordinated management of meaning theory and practice of communication. More information about CMM can be found at cmminstitute.substack.com. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.